I'm going to put a word on the screen. You ever play one of those association games where you got a word, you got to associate? So here's your word. First thing that comes to mind, just see what the image is. Just take note of what the feeling is when I just put up the word fire. Someone says ice, escape, fun, hot, fire and brimstone, yes? Burning. Wait, I have five people at one time. Say again? Hot dogs. How come nobody said steak? Come on, steak. All right, so we got a lot of different. Did you hear different attitudes in those answers? I mean, some of them are attitudes of joy. Would you say, there's that idea of gathering around fire, but there's also a little bit of fear in there, right? We had some fear words that showed up. Isn't it true that fire can be both? And as an illustration, Steve, thanks for the hot dog, but I went with steak, okay? That is a glorious picture, is it not? Oh man, I love it when the lines get on there, when they just get grilled into that steak so nicely. But when the fire gets out of control, which sometimes it does with my grill, it looks more like this. And that's not a good thing for your steak. I don't know anybody's steak that actually looks good that way. So fire can be a positive thing, it can be a negative thing. In a positive sense, here's fire actually warming up air, and because warm air rises, right? It just pulls the balloon up. That's a beautiful thing to watch, a hot air balloon go up. Also, if it gets later at night, the glow that's inside here, it's just a great thing, but it only works if the fire is contained. Would you agree? That's a tragedy. We all love gathering around a campfire, right? Especially on a cool night. We love the feeling of that warmth from the fire. Nobody gets those same emotions gathering around a house fire, though. Would you agree? Okay, so fire elicits different emotions and different feelings because fire itself is kind of neutral. Would you agree with that? But what if we put up the word fire right next to God? Now what comes to mind? Purification. What else? Did somebody say love? What else? Hell and heaven, judgment, retribution. Isn't it true that, again, we have the same fire with God, and there's images all over the place of, there's the wrath of God in hell and judgment, but there's also all these images, like some of the things you said. The image that comes to my mind with fire in a positive sense is when Isaiah sees the Lord high and lifted up. You remember this? He has this vision of God, and he feels so unworthy to be in God's presence that I'm a man of sinful lips. He can't even speak before God. And the angel goes over to the burning hot coals and takes from the fire a coal and places it on his lips. What should sear his lips actually frees him and purifies him. Somebody said purification earlier. What a beautiful imagery of God and fire being positive, not negative. And yet, when you read stuff about the fires of judgment, and somebody said brimstone, fire and brimstone being rained down, it's terrifying, right? So the question that comes up is, why is fire both a glorious thing and a terrifying thing? When we're talking about God and the image that he likes to use. He loves this visual of fire. He knows what we're like. We need symbols, and he gives us this symbol, and it's such a powerful symbol, and it elicits all these emotions. On the opposite sides, glory. The Shekinah glory of God resting upon the temple is a fireball in the midst of the camp of Israel. That's beautiful. And yet very destructive as that fire just breaks out against the camp at another time because of their sin. Why does God do this? This is the question I'd like us to wrestle with. Before we do that, let me just review what we're doing real quick as a church, because we're going through this devotional that we've created to match up with our year called I'm In. A lot of you have it and are filling it out. Others have other Bible plans, and I'm just happy you're on a Bible plan. So please don't feel I'm ever judging you if you're on an inferior Bible plan than ours. I'm not. Any Bible plan is great. This one, though, will go along with our messages. And if you've been going along with our messages, you know, wow, we've been in Exodus, and we've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff. What's that idea of being I'm in? It's the idea of being devoted to God. And I want to share with you first time I can recall just this feeling of, wow, I really am devoted to God. I was a teenager with some other guys. I went to a church just with my sister, my younger sister, Jennifer, my rest of my family. They didn't go to church except for Easter time, that kind of family. That's the family I grew up in. And when we would go to church, it just felt so great. And I was really enjoying the fellowship, and I got close to the guys. And it was a Saturday morning. We were at a breakfast with the youth minister and eating at Denny's, I think it was. And afterwards, they're like, well, we've got this service project, Jeff, why don't you come along with us? So I go to call my mom, and of course back then it's payphone. I got to use payphone and put the money in the receiver and dial up. And no, it was not one of these. Okay, I'm not that old. It was push button. Okay, just for clarification, because I saw you. So I'm talking to my mom, and I say, when service project, want to go out with these guys? Can I go with these guys? And she says yes. But afterwards she said, but Jeff, I'm kind of concerned that you're spending a little too much time with church. And I'm worried that, you're doing a lot of this religious stuff, and it's a lot. It's a lot. And I realized at that moment, because I couldn't understand, Mom, what in the world? This is something I want to do. It's not something I feel like I have to do. I want to do this. I'm passionate about this. And, that is the earliest recollection I can have, that I have in my walk with God, where I'm like, I'm sold out, I'm all in, I want to do this thing, I'm devoted. Isn't it interesting? Same set of circumstances. My mom sees it as, wow, you're giving way too much time to the church, they're really using you, or you're overcommitting, and I'm looking at the same exact set of time that I'm spending, and I'm saying, I love this. This is exactly what I want to do. I'm passionate about this, I'm devoted to this. And maybe this image of fire that God gives us, maybe this image of fire is something that he knows people are going to take differently. They're going to see God differently in fire based on where they're at in their life. It's a terrifying thing to face the fire of God. But it's a beautiful, glorious thing to face the fire of God. And it all depends on where you're at and what you're prepared for when you approach God. Would you agree? So that's where we're at in the I'm In series. We're in Exodus. Crazy stuff's happening. And if you remember, there's a lot of violence in the world, and we're going to be introduced to this guy named Moses today. We're a little behind because you actually read about Moses 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you remember this, but we weren't here last week because of a little bit of wind. So we're doing a little catch-up. We will be caught up by next Sunday. But here's the deal. I want to talk about God's introduction to Moses' life. God has to reintroduce himself to Moses. And that may sound strange to you because Moses is like the hero of the story. If you've seen the Ten Commandments, you know Moses is the one that goes before Pharaoh and says, let my people go, and he's speaking for God. And yet Moses is really at this point, before God introduces himself to Moses, Moses doesn't show a lot of qualities that he's close to God at all. In fact, you could look at his life later on when his wife gets upset with him because she has to circumcise the children. And you read that passage, you're like, why is she circumcising their children? It's because Moses wasn't a faithful Jew. He didn't do it. His relationship with God is distant. And the reason it's distant is because he grew up as an Egyptian. Seriously, when he was little, he heard stories of the God of the Bible, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But as he got older, he was schooled in the palace, and he was trained in the palace. He was the child of the daughter of Pharaoh. And so he grows up as an Egyptian. He eats Egyptian food. He dresses like an Egyptian. He probably walked like an Egyptian. He's an Egyptian for all purposes. And when he actually kills a man and flees, where did he learn that? He learned that from the culture that he lived in. It's a violent culture. The Pharaoh of that time, he's the meanest, craziest dude we've met so far in the Bible. He's killing babies to control population. It's crazy. And there's all this violence. And so Moses himself, he learns violence. We see Hebrews fighting each other. There's violence everywhere. We talked about this last week. Violence is just an indicator of how far the people are from God. Any time in history where there's a whole lot of violence among a culture, it just shows you that culture is far from God. You can go all the way back to the beginning and look at the first children, Cain killing Abel, and it happens all. God floods the world because of violence. And we have to ask ourselves, oh, well, we're starting to change our laws so that we can kill babies, and we're changing our standards, and on a personal level, we have to all be honest, and I'm not judging what you're into or what you do, but don't we consume a whole lot of violence today? And so God has to get this entire, not just Egypt's attention, boy, is he going to get Egypt's attention. He's like, I'm going to show you who the true God is, not all your little animal pretend gods. I'm going to dominate every one of those and show you who the true God is. But he has to show the Israelites who he is. It's been 430 years since Jacob's children, Joseph's story. 430 years is a long time. They've forgotten who God is. Think about this. As a nation, we have been around a little over 200 years. They've been enslaved for 400 years. They don't really even know God. And now Moses, he heard stories maybe when he was little, but he's like an Egyptian. He doesn't know God. And when he flees and when he runs and when he hides out many, many miles away in the place of Midian, that's a place where they worship a lot of Baal. They're Baal worshipers. At least in that area we know of that. We don't know this family that he started to move in with. He's called a Midianite priest. You know, that sounds like a really good thing, and maybe it was. Maybe Jethro, the one that he worked for, and then he married a daughter, so became his father-in-law. Maybe Jethro is a really, really good religious man, but we have no idea what kind of faith he had. We don't know what Moses picked up from. What we do know is God is going to show up to Moses like it's the very first time, and it's going to be a pretty powerful introduction. God needs to introduce himself to Moses so that Moses can go and represent God and introduce himself not just to Pharaoh, but to all the Israelite children who've forgotten God. So that's where we pick up today. So here's his encounter. Now Moses, he's no longer clean-shaven like an Egyptian would be and dressed in all the pretty stuff. They were very much into pretty. Even the men were into pretty in Egypt. He's not pretty anymore. He's now a shepherd, bearded. He's not the clean-cut, shaven guy. This is 40 years later. He's run for his life. He's like in his own personal witness protection program. He has no intention of ever going back to Egypt or ever being found out. He started his life over. He's a fugitive. And he's fine being a shepherd. He's married, he has family, everything's reestablished. And God shows up. And you may remember how God shows up. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock, to the far side of the desert. This desert, we find out, is actually the desert of Sinai, and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb is a very important mountain, and you probably know it as Mount Sinai. It sits at the base, or it's at the desert's at the base of the mountain, and we call it Mount Sinai because it's at the base of the Sinai Desert. And so we're going to come back to this because this mountain is really important later on. There, the angel of the Lord appeared, and we find out later that's actually God, to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. So a bush is on fire. Moses saw, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So even though it's on fire, the fire's dancing on top and the leaves are still green, nothing is burning up. And he's getting curious, so he said, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. So it's pure curiosity. He goes to see, what in the world is this thing? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. He says, do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Now, holy means set apart. God is setting apart this ground that Moses is standing upon as something that he is going to use. Of course, the entire mountain is set apart for God. We're going to find that out later. But certainly right around the bush, because God has shown up there, and he's going to use it for his purposes to commission Moses to go back to Egypt. So this is holy ground. And so Moses takes off his sandals. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He has to introduce himself to Moses, and Moses remembers as a little guy, Mom, when he was actually taken care of by Mom before he went into the Egyptian palace, that Mom would talk about the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and this all comes back to him now. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So his feet are bare, his sandals are off, and he's hiding his face from God. He has fear. All of a sudden, that beautiful little dancing fire on top of, that would have been fascinating. Oh, how cute. Look at that tree. I wonder why it does it. How does that work? I don't know. All of a sudden, that fire can kill me. And he's terrified. Because he felt like he was like dried grass stepping close to the flames and singed, dead on the spot. That's how he felt. We're actually told, this is in the New Testament, because sometimes people think, well, the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament, those are two different gods. They're not. God is very consistent, and all the love that you find in the New Testament, you'll find in the Old Testament. All the holiness of God you'll find in the Old Testament, you'll find in the New Testament. And so the writer of Hebrews quotes the Old Testament, which is kind of cool because now he's connecting the two. And his quote is simply this: God is a consuming fire. And Moses knows that to be true as he stands there terrified before the fire of God. He's afraid for his life. God could just take him at any moment, and he stands there, holy ground, holy God, the God of my ancestors. He's terrified. This is the God who not only can engulf a bush on the side of a mountain, but speaks and stars are flown out into the sky. You realize that the stars that are out there that look so tiny because they twinkle, twinkle, those little stars, you know what I'm talking about? Those stars, most of them are bigger than our sun. In fact, many, many times larger than our sun. It is just absolutely crazy to think that God speaks and stars are flung into the universe. That's our holy God. And I think sometimes we take God way too casually, don't you? I mean, God who is a consuming fire, and we're just like, no, he's my buddy. Don't you have like the buddy attitude with God? Like, I can just come to God anytime I have a need. And I'm not saying that's wrong or that's bad. I'm just questioning that maybe we don't have enough respect for God. Like he has the power to speak and change our life in innumerable ways, including death. He's powerful. He's glorious. He's huge. He's strong. He's all those attributes that sometimes we just put him aside and we say, God's my pal. He's my friend. I'm not saying don't use friend. I'm saying be careful that we don't get so casual with God that we've lost that awe and wonder. If Moses is introduced to God, and really, I think this is the first time he has been really introduced to God. And God chooses to show up in fire and tells Moses, get your shoes off. You're standing before the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses' response is proper. And maybe our response needs to be closer to that. Maybe we take it too casual. And I'm not saying you're going to get burned if you don't have reverence and awe for God. I'm not saying that. I'm saying actually it may be worse. Because maybe we should be singed a little in our rear so that we get it, right? Because sometimes, that singeing in the rear, that's kind of like God spanking you. And that may be a good thing, to get you back in line. Maybe you need a swat or two to say, hey, treat me with a little bit more respect. And it just occurred to me that this is a very disrespectful way to talk about God getting us back in line, sorry. So here is the idea. Maybe what we need is for us to have a proper fear of God. Like as you approach the fire and you want to get warmed by that fire and yet you love the fire, you just recognize that fire is dangerous too. It's not that the fire is against you. You built that fire to warm yourself with, but you still respect it. You don't jump in the middle of it and say, it's my fire. I made this. It'd be crazy. You respect the fire, but you want to be close to it. And that's what I'm saying. That maybe what we need to do is to have a little bit more reverence for God, a little bit more proper fear of God. The proverb writer says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You want to have a wise life, you want to do things the right way, then begin with fear. And I think sometimes a lot of us, we walk into the presence of God with our shoes on, not even caring that we're trampling all over sacred things, because we are approaching God. And where God is, it's holy. And we expect something really cool to happen, and maybe what actually happens is nothing. Maybe we get nothing because we haven't approached God right. We haven't come to Him as one who is respectful and reverent and worshipful of God. You ever felt nothing from God? I think every one of us probably could say, yeah, I feel that. I know what that's like, and I don't like that. When I was a teenager and I was sharing with you that I just knew, I'm in. This is it. I'm devoted to God. I had an expression, and I would tell my friends, and my friends would tell me, because we were on fire for God. We'd say, we're on fire for God. We're on fire for Him. And I don't think that meant literally like we're the tree and the fire's just coming off of us. I don't think anybody saw any flames coming off of us. I think it meant that we were so close to God that we could feel His fire, that we reflected His warmth, that we were filled with that passion that God is. And that we wanted so badly to be in ministry with God, moving in His direction, doing what He leads us to do because He's with us, and we could feel that He was with us. I just fear that maybe if we don't begin here, maybe we don't feel anything. And God just waits until we get it. Yeah, He's our friend. But it begins with He's God, our holy, holy, holy God. Now, this is just the beginning, right? I mean, we can't stop here. We have to take it the rest of the way. And in fact, what's really cool is Moses actually takes off his sandals and averts his eyes. God begins to speak to him the reason why he showed up in the bush. God didn't come to scare Moses to death. That was not His purpose. It seems like it. He wants to just freak Moses out, but that's not His purpose. He's come to share His ministry. He's going to send Moses. He wants Moses to do something for Him. And so He starts sharing His ministry. Now, listen as I read this to the passion in God's voice for His people. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. And I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. So here's God in all of His passion and all of His fiery words. He says to us, I want so badly for them to be rescued. And I think we miss that so often because we know God is going to send Moses to Egypt to enact 10 plagues. In fact, He says, Moses, take the staff in your hand, and through you and your staff, I will make the sea blood, and I will fill the sky with gnats, and I will put frogs, and I will do these devastating plagues, one after another to the Egyptians. And we look at that and we think, well, God is He's raining down His wrath, and it's just awful. And what we forget is, that's true for the Egyptians, but for the Israelites, each one of these is God's act of rescue. He has seen their torment, He has seen their pain, and God is bringing them out. It's not one of them mentions fire, but it's like fire in the sense that where you stand is how you see it. The Egyptians are terrified. The Israelites have to come to respect and honor God. And we see that in the very last plague as He asks them to do all of these ritualistic things to prepare for the death angel that will pass over, and they do everything according to how God says so that their home is protected from that angel. It is their deliverance. I asked my son, Actually, Riley was there too. Caden was the one that answered. It was our evening devotions, and it was 2 weeks ago, and I asked them, why is it that the tree that is on fire doesn't get burned up? I mean, Moses is standing there in the presence of God, and Moses is fearful for his life. And I imagine if Moses had come any closer, God said, "Stop, do not get any closer," then Moses would have burned to death. Why did the tree not burn to death? And my son just quickly answered. He said, because God was showing us that he can save us. Yeah. So fire then is both the passionate, holy purity of God that demands that sin be punished, and yet God's fire is just as strong in his passion for our own hearts, our own souls, our own lives. And my kids are like, yeah, we get that. Yeah, sure. I'm like, no, I don't think you do, because if you did, you'd be like me. But it's the passion of God. They're like, yeah, I see that. Yeah, fire, it's the passion. And then I started to worry that maybe this message wasn't going to mean anything to you. Fire is God's way of showing his holiness, his purity, but it's his way of showing his glory and his grace. And he wants us to see this. And what I think is so cool is that when God finally frees them, they go and Moses gives the 10 plagues, and they get out of Egypt, they go through the Red Sea. When God saves them and rescues them, there's a very specific thing that he does. He leads them back to the mountain of God. Remember I said earlier, that's a very important mountain. He's going to lead them all the way back to the mountain of God. Back where the burning bush was. He's going to bring them back there. It's a long journey. It's going to take them 3 months to get there, though. Midian's pretty far away. And as they begin to travel back to the mountain of God, God does something. He himself leads them. Because he is rescuing. He loves his people. He is passionate about his people. He is not going to allow them to get lost. He is not going to allow them to get destroyed. He's going to protect them. He's going to feed them. He's going to give them water. He is going to protect them. And the way he does it is this way. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them, on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire. He guides them by fire to give them light so that they could travel by day or night. Now, ever since I was a teenager and read this verse, I had a vision in my mind of how this looked. I had a real problem with the idea that, okay, so at 7 p.m. at night, that cloud, that's a nice puffy little cute cloud that's leading the Israelites, at 7 o'clock it just disappears. And then a flame comes and dances and leads them. I'm like, no, I don't think that's how it really was. Now, I could be totally wrong. This is just my thought. But I'm thinking that this cloud by day is more like a smoke cloud. And it's smoke because it's fire always. Nothing changes. You can't see the flames during the day. All you can see is the great smoke that is coming from it because it's a great fire in the sky. And then at night, as it gets a little bit darker, you can start to see red, and you can start to see yellow, and you can start to see the lights inside, the fire inside the cloud. At night, you don't even see the smoke. You see the flames. It would have been a glorious sight. Have I ever mentioned to you that I should make movies? It was a dream of mine, a passion of mine when I was younger. So that's how I see it. I could be totally wrong, but the idea is still there. God guided them by fire. The same image that he uses to talk about destruction. And he will use fire against his enemies and even those within his own Israelites who disobey him. And so sometimes it's really hard for us to get our heads around this idea that God is both a fire in a good way and a fire in a bad way. But we need to. We really do. Because God is all of this. And he is all of this at the same time. And it's all how you approach him. When you build a beautiful big bonfire, you get close enough to be warmed by him. He wants you to be close enough to be warmed by him. You don't jump in the middle of it and like, I want to be burned by him. No, that's crazy. God should be respected but close to you. And that's what he longs for, and that's what he wants so badly. The question is, how do we do this, right? How do we have this kind of of tension between the holiness and the love of God. I want to read one more verse to you that shows you, I think, how you can do this. In order to get there, we need to finish the journey. They are traveling for 3 months towards the mountain of God. They finally arrive in the desert of Sinai. That's where they camp. That's where they set up camp. Moses, there's no burning bush, by the way, on the mountain. They can see the mountain. They don't know it's special. It's just a mountain to them. And there's no bush burning, nothing like that. Moses goes back up onto the mountain, and God tells him, look, tomorrow I'm going to show up on this mountain. I want you to prepare the people. And so you consecrate them. That means they need to ceremonially wash and get ready and change their clothes and all that. They need to change their underwear. They need to get ready. So they're getting themselves ready. Moses, by the way, has some of his men build a barrier so that they can't cross, because if they cross this barrier, they might accidentally touch the mountain of God when God shows up. Remember, he tells Moses, take off your sandals. He's not even going to let them touch it. He says, they'll die if they touch this mountain. So you make a barrier. The next morning, they're all kind of scared. They're all clean and they're ready and they're kind of scared. And God shows up in thunder and lightning, and all this smoke fills the top of the mountain. God comes down on the top of the mountain in fire. And yet the mountain doesn't burn up. It's like the bush, only bigger. And they're all terrified and they're all scared and they're all standing back. There's no way they're crossing that line anyway. And then God begins to speak. And what's amazing to me is, sometimes we forget this, by the way, that when God spoke, he's actually giving the 10 Commandments to the people, to everybody. And a lot of times we think, oh, no, the 10 Commandments were written on tablets. Moses carried them down with him. Afterwards, Moses will carry the 10 Commandments down. But right now, he just speaks to the people. Moses is actually down in the crowd with them while God is speaking the 10 Commandments. So the mountain's on fire and God's speaking the 10 Commandments. And remember, Moses, when he approaches the bush, he covers his face when he realizes this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. This is the God Almighty. I'm going to die if I look at him. They're covering their ears and they're crying out, thinking they're going to die because they're hearing the voice of God. It's so terrifying to them. And they go to Moses and say, Moses, please go up onto the mountain. Please go up on the mountain. You talk to God. You talk to God and then tell us what he says. Don't let him keep talking to us or we're going to die. And Moses yells to the people and get them, no, wait. You guys don't understand. You don't get it. See, at this point, Moses finally gets it. He finally understands God. He's like, no, you're seeing God as wanting to destroy you. Don't you remember what he did? Every plague was for you to bring you out. Splitting the Red Sea was for you to bring the cloud of fire was for you. He wants to save you. They're like, but we're terrified of him. We're terrified. So here's what Moses says. Do not be afraid. Don't be terrified. Don't be scared for your life. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. So he's yelling this out to the crowd so everyone can hear. I don't want you to be afraid of him like he's going to kill you. I just want you to be afraid of him, because that kind of awe and that kind of worship and that kind of respect is what this relationship with this holy and loving God has to begin with. You have to start here. You're going to learn to love him because he absolutely loves you. But right now, take off your sandals, cover your eyes, respect him, and get close enough to feel the warmth. Because what you're feeling is the passion of God. He absolutely loves you. Would you do me a favor? I want you to close your eyes. I want you to see that bush in front of you. That bush is on fire. I want you to see the flames dancing and see how beautiful it is. Take your sandals off. You're on holy ground. Don't be terrified. It's good. God's invited you here. But respect him. Be warmed by that fire. Be filled by that fire. Be changed by that fire. Allow him to love you with the same intensity and passion that he hates and destroys sin. Allow him to take a coal from that fire and touch your lips to cleanse you, to forgive you of all your sins, to burn it out of you. You see, that person in front of you in that fire is none other than Jesus. The very one who took the very fires of hell upon himself on the cross, experiencing the full wrath of the judgment of God. Why in the world did God do that? Because He's just as passionate, on fire for you, loves you like crazy. What Jesus has allowed us to do is crazy, though, because what He allows us to do is actually touch Him and hug Him. And I know it may seem strange, but you can step into the fire and let Him hug you now. His death has paid for the wrath of God. You can now be on fire for Jesus. You can open your eyes. Our I'm in statement for this week. You can write it in your bulletins. You can put it in your booklets. We're on the next page now in our booklets. I'm in awe. My prayer for you this week is that you have a worshipful week. A week of reverence and awe. Seeing God as no less than the love you've always seen Him, but now maybe even more so, because He is fire. He is a consuming fire. He consumes sin with wrath. He consumes us in His love. He's all-consuming. Worship God. Worship God this week with everything you've got, because Jesus Christ worshiped by giving His life for you with everything He's got. I'm going to ask that you stand. We're going to pray one more time. This is your prayer of decision. If you have a decision for the Lord, as soon as we're done, the team is going to sing. I invite you to come forward and just give yourself to Jesus if you've never done that. Just I'm ready. I'm ready to surrender to this passionate God who loves me this much. We're going to invite you to just come. Father God, we ask for you to stir our hearts and to move us forward and to help us to just confess Christ as our Savior. Father, for the rest of us, I pray that this would be a worshipful week as we stand in awe of God. Stand in awe of you. You are an amazing, beautiful, powerful, good God. You're filled with wonder. In a sense, we tremble before you. In another sense, we delight before you. Help us keep that tension this week. Help us to recognize how holy and how loving you are. That your goodness is not just that you're our buddy, but that you are our God. You are our Father. You are our Lord. And you're our friend. Help us keep all of that in mind. We pray for a powerful week. In Jesus' name, amen. If you have a decision this morning, I invite you just to come. If you need prayer, just come.